3 days after Vincent Marlowe was found face down in the Chicago River, with every account he'd ever touched frozen by federal order, people stopped asking who had done it. They started asking how. The answer was sitting in a third-floor apartment in Bridgeport, watering a philodendron and listening to Coltrane. Nobody had expected it from her. Nobody ever does. Her name was Rosaria Venn. She was 34, broad-shouldered and full-figured in the way of women who take up space without apology, the kind of presence that fills a room before she says a single word. She'd spent 11 years as a forensic accountant for the city of Chicago before the city decided budget cuts mattered more than the people who found the money others were stealing. After that, she'd moved back to her mother's old neighborhood on the south side, into the same 3-flat where she'd grown up, and taken on private clients quietly. She was good at finding things people tried to hide. She was better at staying invisible herself. For 2 years, she'd lived next door to the man everyone in the building called Mr. D. Domenico Sartori wasn't a mystery to anyone who paid attention. He was 42, ran a private import firm out of the West Loop, and had a particular stillness about him that made people across a dinner table choose their words carefully without quite knowing why. His actual business, the real architecture of it, was the kind that didn't appear in any filing with the Secretary of State. He controlled freight movement through 3 Midwest ports. He had judges, and he had debts, and he had loyalty that ran deeper than money. Because money he'd earned late, the loyalty he'd built from nothing. Rosaria had noticed him the way you notice weather, unavoidably, without drama. She'd seen him leave flowers at the cemetery 3 blocks east every single Thursday morning, without fail, rain or snow or the particular gray misery of a Chicago February. She'd asked the groundskeeper once, casually, the way neighbors ask things. The grave was his mother's. He'd been going every week for 6 years. She knew, because the building talked, because buildings always do, that his mother had died while he was serving 4 years at Stateville. That he hadn't been there. That he'd asked his then second-in-command, a man named Bracco, to keep the visits going in his absence. Bracco hadn't gone once. Nobody had told Domenico, and Domenico, when he got out, had simply started going himself. Every Thursday. Without ever mentioning the years the grave had been left alone. Rosaria understood something about that kind of grief. She recognized the specific weight of it, the way it doesn't announce itself, the way a person just absorbs it and keeps moving. Her own mother's grave was in the same cemetery, 1 row east. That was how she'd first seen him, standing in the November cold with his hands at his sides and his head slightly bowed, not praying exactly, just present. The way people stand when they're trying to give something back that can't be given back. They'd nodded at each other across the headstones. That had been the beginning of whatever it was. It wasn't courtship. It wasn't friendship exactly. It was the particular closeness of 2 people who share the same geography of loss without needing to explain it. He'd started leaving coffee on her doorstep on Thursday mornings. Take-out cups from the place on 35th he drove past on the way back. She'd started leaving food in return because she cooked the way her mother had, in quantities suited for a family she didn't have. Neither of them named what it was. The threat arrived on a Tuesday. She was running a standard audit for a hotel group that had hired her to find where $300,000 had gone between their books and their reported revenue. It wasn't Domenico's business. She was clear about keeping lines clean, and he'd never asked her to cross them. But cross-referencing shell entities was the kind of work that required pulling from state incorporation records, and the name she found buried in the 4th layer of an LLC structure, registered in Delaware, operating address in Schaumburg, signatory one Marco Vitelli, was the name of Domenico's current head of operations. She sat with that for a long time. Vitelli had been with Domenico for 8 years. He was at the table for every significant decision. He had access to freight schedules, contact networks, the location of every asset Domenico had moved in the last 3 years. And he was, quietly and methodically, siphoning those assets into a structure controlled by a man named Vincent Marlowe, who was not a friend of Domenico's, who was, in fact, the man who had tried twice in the previous decade to take the port contracts away from him and had been stopped both times. She understood immediately what she was looking at. Vitelli wasn't stealing for himself. He was building a war chest for Marlowe. He was handing Domenico's entire operational infrastructure to an enemy, piece by piece, and timing it for a moment when Domenico would be exposed and Marlowe would be ready. Rosaria sat at her desk for 3 hours and looked at what she'd found. She was not in Domenico's world. She had no claim on his trust and no formal standing in whatever surrounded him. She had coffee on Thursday mornings and the comfortable shorthand of two people who live next door for long enough that silence stops being awkward. That was all. She could close the file. She could refer the hotel to a different set of findings and leave the larger picture alone. Nobody would know what she'd seen. Nobody would come looking for her. She'd be safe. She picked up her phone and called him. She said, "I need you to come over. Bring nothing with you. Tell no one where you're going." He came in 14 minutes. He had that quality, the ability to hear the specific gravity in a person's voice and respond to it without wasting time. She walked him through it the way she would have walked a client through an audit, methodically, without drama, with the documents laid out in sequence so that each piece explained the next. She showed him the LLC structure. She showed him the transfer pattern. She showed him the dates, which mapped precisely onto moments when Vitelli had been in the room for strategic conversations. She showed him the signatory. Domenico didn't move while she talked. He stood at her kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his face completely still. And she watched him absorb it the way he'd absorbed everything she knew about him, without falling apart, without needing it to be different than it was. When she finished, he said, "How long have you known?" 3 hours. He looked at her for a moment. "You could have said nothing." "Yes. Why didn't you?" She thought about that honestly. "Because Thursday mornings matter. And I didn't want to be the person who knew and stayed quiet." What Dr. Bessel van der Kolk documented in his decades of trauma research applies here in an unexpected direction. Loyalty, he found, is not primarily a rational calculation. It is the body's response to witnessing someone carry something heavy without asking to be relieved of it. Rosaria had watched Domenico carry 6 years of Thursday mornings. Her nervous system had already made a decision her conscious mind was only now catching up to. Domenico made 3 calls from her apartment. He made them in the kitchen while she sat in the other room, and she didn't listen, because that was the kind of line she understood without being told. When he came back, he said, "Vitelli's meeting Marlowe tonight. I'd like you to be somewhere safe until this is done." "I'd like to finish what I started," she said. He looked at her again. That particular way he had of actually looking, not scanning, not assessing, but taking in what was there. What does that mean? Marlowe has 2 holding companies registered in Illinois that haven't been touched yet. If those get frozen before he moves to liquidate, he loses the runway he needs to fund what comes next. I can file the complaint with the Financial Crimes Division tonight. I know the right person. It'll go through by morning. He was quiet for a moment. "You'd be visible." "I'm already visible. I found it. That doesn't change." She met his eyes. "Let me do the part I'm actually good at." He said yes. Not immediately. There was a moment where she could see him recalibrating something, adjusting a picture he'd built of her, and finding it wasn't quite large enough for what was actually standing in front of him. Then, yes. What happened next happened in 2 registers simultaneously, the way finales do when they've been properly built. Vitelli arrived at a warehouse in Cicero to meet Marlowe. He found Domenico there instead. The conversation was brief. Vitelli was a man who had told himself for 8 years that he was being practical, that Domenico's empire was already declining, that attaching himself to Marlowe was the rational choice of a man who understood which way the water was moving. He believed his own story. That's the specific mechanism Robert Cialdini documented in his study of commitment and self-justification. Once a person has committed to a course of action, the mind constructs a supporting narrative powerful enough to survive considerable contrary evidence. Vitelli had been building his narrative for 2 years. It collapsed in about 4 minutes. He was taken care of. The method was efficient and left nothing to manage afterward. Vincent Marlowe woke the next morning to discover that his 2 Illinois holding companies had been frozen pending a financial crimes investigation, that the complaint had been filed by a forensic accountant whose documentation was, by all accounts, immaculate, and that his primary inside asset had gone completely unreachable. By noon, federal agents were at his office. By evening, he was in custody. By the time his lawyers started untangling the paperwork, the accountant who'd filed the complaint had moved on to other cases. Her name appeared once in the public record, and then receded. She was very good at staying invisible when she chose to. Domenico came by on Thursday morning. He left 2 coffees this time. He knocked instead of leaving them on the mat. When she opened the door, he said, "I want to ask you something. I want to do it properly, which means I need you to understand what I'm actually asking." She waited. "I'm asking if you want a seat at the table," he said. "Not a protected seat, an equal one. There are things I deal with where your particular skill is not a convenience. It's the difference between what I know and what I don't. I've been managing with less than I could have for a long time because I didn't trust the right people." He paused. "I'm asking if you want to be someone I trust with the parts that matter." She looked at him standing in her doorway in the Thursday morning light with 2 coffee cups and that particular stillness of his, and she thought about her mother's grave 1 row east from his mother's grave, and she thought about 3 hours she'd spent staring at a file before picking up the phone, and she said, "Ask me again after coffee." He stepped inside. The people who run cities like this one, the real people, not the elected ones, understand one thing above all, that power isn't held by the loudest person in the room. It's held by the person who knows what no one else knows and chooses carefully what to do with it. Rosaria Venn had always known that. She'd just been waiting for a room worth entering. If this story stayed with you, leave a like. It lets the algorithm know someone stopped scrolling long enough to actually feel something. And subscribe, because the next story involves a woman who translated for a cartel negotiation and walked out with something nobody expected her to take.